Well, I think that's very appropriate, because what you have to do is you have to marry an oil man or something to break anything, as far as I can see. I want to thank Fred. He's imposed on me for the last 2 months a burden that I'm delighted to say is about to disappear, because I'm about to speak on it. But he said, would I introduce the session on the origins of women's oppression? And I said, no, Fred, I can't. And he said, well, of course you can. And I said, no, I know nothing about the origins of women's oppression. In fact, I don't even call myself a feminist. I'm a socialist, and I've never really discussed anything to do with women, theoretically. And he said, oh, it'd be very good for you. Basically, it sounded like my mother. And as a result, I agreed, because I suddenly thought this would be an opportunity to do a bit of reading that would be good for me. There was something else that happened, of course, and we're all aware of it. I think I was shocked by something that came out around the question of the morass inside the SWP and what happened. And I was shocked when I suddenly read that the term feminist was being used as a term of abuse inside, or not even abuse, it may have been, the pressure on people inside the SWP. And I think for the very first time I suddenly felt a bit like Sartre, who, when, I think it was Sartre who said something along the lines of, as long as there's anti-Semitism, I'll call myself a Jew. And it suddenly felt like that, as long as there's this sort of position taken on feminism, then maybe I should adopt the term feminist for the first time, but I can't say I'm very eager to do so. However, what I decided to do was, I'm very conscious, and have always been conscious, that there are contentious categories. Women, sex, gender, feminism, patriarchy are all terms that in fact are used not in the women's movement, and not by feminists, I think, in an unthinking way, but I think for a lot of people, that they're masks, they're sort of misleading fictions, and they're almost like the naturalized given. These are statements that everybody understands. And, for example, there's always been women's oppression, and it's another sort of thing that is always assumed. But I do have to say that the legacy of the IMG is very strong in me, and I joined in '68. And I was not in the IMG for very long, partly because I ended up having a child and decided that it was not possible to do 2 things at once, or 3 things at once: work, having a child, and being in the IMG. But one of the things that stuck with me all the time was a sort of a phrase that came out, which was, if appearance equals essence, there'd be no need for science. And it is the fact, the need to keep constantly digging away and understanding things, and to recognize that. So I suppose those are the sort of background bits to what I'm going to talk about. There were 2 things, therefore, that I decided to read. The first was The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Now, I read that in the 60s, and it was one, for me, I think, of an absolutely formative text for me when I was young. And the reasons for it are the following. She's a philosopher, and reading her, you feel that, in fact, it's a woman who's really grappling with ideas. She's an existentialist, which certainly for me when I was very young was absolutely essential, in the sense that, and it bears back to this whole thing about Thatcher again, that I grew up believing that I had to act, that I had to make choices. And it's not the choices of Thatcherism, where you're offered, one grey building, or you could choose another grey building. It is that, in fact, this was real choices about the way that one lives and the way that you are. And the other important thing about de Beauvoir was that she was a woman. And I thought, therefore, that I should go back to rereading The Second Sex. And I think it was very illuminating that you open the first chapter, and the very first question she asks is, what is a woman? And she then goes on to say that no man writing would start with saying what is a man, because for a man it is all humanity. We represent all. For a woman it's a very, very specific question. And the other thing that is a quote that all of us, I'm sure, are aware of, and it was a poster of Simone Beauvoir with it written underneath, was, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. And it's clearly that in fact we are culturally, socially, historically, politically constructed, as are men. But they are different in terms of the influences of them. And the other thing that I think was hugely important about Beauvoir is she recognised that there are biological differences between men and women. Not that they determine, but that there are differences. And the other person who struck me as very important, particularly when I was in my mid-20s, was Tim Panaro. He's writing on materialism, the need to recognise whatever we think, there are material realities in the world which in fact are physical and that we have to recognise. And I think that's something that came out quite strongly reading through the Beauvoir. And she asks various questions, I think the thing that's interesting, she says, are women weaker? And she says only because it is in the light of the aims that man, and she talks about this, man sets for himself, the instruments at his disposal and the laws he imposes, and the body, the actual physical body of anybody, can be seen in the light only of culture. It is something that in fact is therefore a recognition of this. The other thing that I think is hugely important about her is she accepts and recognises that sexuality plays a considerable role in human life. And at some point she says it could be said to penetrate it completely. Now, the idea that she uses the term penetration is, an interesting sort of reflection about sexuality, but it's very, very clear that that's something she never avoids. And she says that a woman's defined as a human being in search of values. She accepts that humanity is not an animal species, but a historical reality. It is this thing about the fact that we are human, but therefore we're species beings, as Marx said. We are conscious, we are attempting to grapple with nature, and we are therefore a different type of species from any other animal. And she, as I said, she rejects totally biological determinism. I mean, it's very, very striking in all that she's writing. But interestingly, she goes through the reasons for women's oppression. I mean, as well as huge amounts of work on myths, and then she goes through the different stages of woman. But critically, she accepts much of Engels' argument about the way that women's oppression is located in the different types of societies that there have been. And she's critical about the relationship between private property leading to the enslavement of women. She just doesn't think it's clear enough. I mean, she doesn't understand that. But she's certainly much, much more dismissive in the sense of all the psychoanalytical arguments about oppression. So the other person, of course, I had to read was Fred. Not this one, the other one, the one who died. Marx and Engels, in advance of others, and I mean it's just to locate where they are, continued the tradition of Saint-Simon, Fourier, Flora Tristan. I mean, they were part of that post-Enlightenment thinkers who were arguing and demanding sexual equality and the subversion of the bourgeois family. And it was a very clear period from the end of the 18th century through until sort of mid-19th century. You've got a whole series of traditions that were actually contesting this. And it was Marx and Engels who argued the oppression of women was not timeless, but was a result of very specific social formations, that the relation between the sexes was a social construct, and it wasn't something, therefore, that was just, from time immemorial, the relationships would be established. It was about societies. And reading the origins of the family, I mean, it's quite touching when you recognise that Engels was writing this after Marx's death. He'd gone through all Marx's papers, and had come to a huge collection of notes that Marx had made on the origins of the family, on the ancient society, which was Lewis Henry Morgan's work, who was a sort of an anthropologist, not a sort of anthropologist, he was. And he was collecting a mass amount of evidence from all sorts of sources about the way that societies were evolving. And I think one has to be conscious that, you know, in 2013, we'd be much more circumspect about being absolute about these stages theories of social change or societal change. That you know that in fact the boundaries are probably more blurred. There will be some types of groups and societies and social groups that would just die out. There were others that would arrive, and given the sort of levels of technology and sort of contacts with others, would be picking up in very different ways. So, I mean, it isn't as absolute as either Morgan or Engels said, but on the whole, the argument that one has is that in fact that societies evolve in three stages. Now for Morgan, the three stages, and they sound pretty grim now, are savagery, barbarism and civilization. And of course we know where civilization is. We can just have a look around us to see, you know, the poor and the oppressed under, you know, the bits of cardboard and the wars and but that is the height of civilization. This is the apogee that we've arrived at now. Whereas, of course, savagery and barbarism might, you know, sound worse, but I'm not so sure they were in many ways. However, and I want to just read something that Marx has said, which is, I mean, I think it's really important, actually. I mean, maybe just because I'm getting very old, so I got to the stage of feeling that, you know, you do have to go back and start rereading things that, you know, you skipped over when you were younger. But I think reading Capital, which I'm doing at the moment, is something that is, you know, is just really, really important. And you keep sort of needing to ground yourself in the ideas of it. But Marx had said, according to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the final instant, the production and reproduction of the immediate essentials of life. This again is of a twofold character. On the one side, the production of the means of existence, articles of food, clothing, dwellings, and the tools necessary for the production. And on the other side, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species, the social organization under which the people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live is determined by both kinds of production, by the stage of development of labor on the one hand and of the family on the other. So we come to Engels. And he wrote this, I mean, it's not quite a thriller, but it's almost. If you decide at night to sort of read it, it's not grim. For those who haven't read it, try it, but if you have read it, you'll know that, you know, there are parts of it. And yes, it is 150 years old. It's, you know, so it's not the modern text, but it's got enough substance in it to actually make it a really worthwhile thing to refer to. And he divided societies into, first of all, classless societies. Now these were the hunter-gatherers. It was 15,000 BC. The period is just midway between the glacial maxima, which is about 30,000, and 21,000, and then the global warming developing in about 11,000. So it was where, in fact, the ice age in the north, in the northern hemisphere, was in fact retreating on the retreat. And it was hunter-gatherers. And Engels claims that in fact these were societies which were hunting and gathering and were on the whole matriarchal societies. They were egalitarian, non-hierarchical, non-oppressive relations between sexes. And the essential contributions of all of the people were necessary for the survival of all. And it was that in fact sexual relations were sort of mixed, open, that there was no identification of particular, there may have been pairs at times, but on the whole, those forms of societies, and they existed then and were found in all sorts of Aboriginal societies and others, where in fact the whole relationship between the people was recognised through the mother. The matriarchal line was matriarchal. Now, there has, of course, been disputes since then, and whether it's actually matriarchal or whether it's locational, whether it's the idea or matrilineal, that because people know if you have open sexual relations, obviously you have no clue who the father is unless you've got genetic testing. Or unless, of course, the child comes out looking so starkly like the man that you can't avoid them. But, I mean, on the whole, it is something that would not be known. So, therefore, all the relationships would tend to go through the mother. And it's very clear that, although there is an argument that for many women it was difficult, but it was difficult for everybody in those circumstances. Food supply was pretty limited. You would be dependent upon climate. You would be dependent upon your ability to be able to cope with either animals or anything else, as well as scarcity. So in the end, it was a survival culture in many ways. And that was something that I think, it's just completely fortuitous, but the other day, if anybody's read or reads or can get hold of the London Review of Books a couple of months ago, there was a review of a book that's just come out called The Creation of Inequality by Flannery and Marcus, and it's apparently a really major, this is because I've read the review, not the book, it's a really major book because what it's done is it's gathered together all the latest evidence around what the transition is between societies that were egalitarian, i.e. these little, sort of, sometimes weren't little, but the sort of hunter-gatherers, to the present day where, of course, hierarchy is absolutely, inequality is absolutely sort of rampaging its way through. But the thing that's interesting in it, and it just says that, in fact, looking at these very primitive, I'm not sure if I can call them primitive, let me call them primitive, these early societies, they were saying that, in fact, the thing that is very clear is, from the current work that's done, the role of humour in these societies played a very large part. It wasn't power, it wasn't physical control, it was humour, it was ridicule, it was teasing. They were all mechanisms of levelling, of ensuring, sort of equality in a sense. The influence wasn't from bullying, but was from generosity, modesty, and diplomacy. Language and intellectual strategies probably evolved to promote this sort of social networking. The absolute imperative was to share. In comparative studies, strikingly, the urge to maintain egalitarianism contrasts with the jostling for power that you find in the primates. Apes, and this is what they say, apes have a sort of priority of the things that motivate them. Sex first, then food, then defense. For humans, it was food, defense, and then sex. And partly, of course, it's about the fact that our sex